I'm very interested in the preservation of video games. Maybe it's because I love history, but anytime a game is radically changed in such a way that its released content is no longer obtainable or operable, I think that something of value is inherently lost. Even if you're the sort of person who fundamentally thinks that video games aren't art, which, by the way, is something that I personally disagree with, it's hard to deny that video games are, at their very least, cultural artifacts that play a significant role in understanding a great deal of our own cultural history. So, during a casual outing with some friends, the topic of 2016's Hitman came up, and I took issue with its elusive target system. Basically, I found the notion that it was content specifically designed to be consumed with an unlimited time gap and with only a single opportunity to complete it successfully a distasteful one. Chiefly because of the fact that if you fail, the contract is outright lost. But then a friend posted the question of, well, what's the difference between that and a patch for, like, any other game? After all, it's essentially the same thing, right? And that whole thing got me thinking about this whole topic and the way I approach it. Because when I was asked that question, I found out I didn't exactly have an answer for him. We live in an age where patches are taken for granted. If a game is released in a shoddy state, we can rest assured that with some reasonable level of certainty, that it will be fixed fairly quickly, especially if it's coming from a AAA studio. Ghost Recon Wildlands, Horizon Zero Dawn, Mass Effect Andromeda, and even the Nintendo freaking Switch itself all had day one patches, adding on to a trend that anybody who's been playing video games as recently as the last few years would be aware of. Frequent content updates aren't really special bonuses anymore. Rather, they're expected, whether in the form of a free content patch or as paid DLC. Okay, hold on. Let's back all this up for a second. You may be wondering why I'm talking about patches and content updates when it's clear from my introduction that the topic I really want to touch upon is video game preservation. And to answer that question that you may or may not be asking right now, though I'm going to choose to believe that you are asking it, I need to break down the role that patches play in the gaming ecosystem. So at its very core, all a patch is a piece of software that changes the code of another piece of software in one form or another. Fun fact, its name actually comes from back in the 1940s when computer software used to be distributed on actual paper tape and computers read data via holes that were punched into said tape. When an update was necessary, a user would need to cut out the indicated portion of that tape and quote-unquote patch in the replacement segment. Nowadays, there are just streams of data sent to our computers and our consoles that are automatically installed. Usually, the file sizes are small because they're largely used to fix minor problems that, if left unchecked, will compile into larger ones. Bug fixes, hotfixes, and maintenance patches all play a role in ensuring that the product that you purchased works as well as it possibly can without overhauling the game's core and ripping its engine files out to do so. But, unlike war, the nature of patches has largely changed over the course of the last 2 decades. You may not remember it, but there was a time when you would need to go to the developer's website, download a zip file, and run an installer in order to patch a game to get it in its working or fixed state on your computer. Which was way more inconvenient because you not only had to know which version of the game you were working with, since a lot of games were re-released on CDs with patches pre-installed, but you would also have to deal with slow internet speeds and the hope that you're not downloading any malicious software on a Ware site you may have accidentally stumbled onto. I've been there. It's not pretty. But this is also a time where expansion packs were just beginning to decline in favor of downloadable content. Thanks largely to Microsoft and the resources it devoted to online play and the promotion of Xbox Live, games slowly started to adapt an easier distribution method of online data. Games like Halo 2, Splinter Cell, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic offered varying amounts of extra content for free, paving the way for patches to be easily accessible on consoles as well as PC. Soon enough, physical expansion packs were phased out and the more cost-effective model of offering DLC took hold. Now, thanks to technology that we have available and the magic of the internet, we have a whole slew of expansive content that we can easily get a hold of, both in the form of paid DLC and free content updates. Alright, got all that? Good. Let's continue. But we've also been spoiled by the system. Given how easy it is to deliver patches these days, and how we no longer merely crave content updates, but we expect them, a certain relationship has developed between game devs and consumers, one which involves more and more content being distributed to a wider audience. And that's generally a good thing. The massive infrastructure now in place thanks to the internet and several savvy entrepreneurs who saw the direction that game distribution was heading is now responsible for the proliferation of niche genres in indie development. That means that there's something out there for everyone. It's a world where just about any game can and probably does exist. For better or for worse. I mean, if it wasn't for the system, I probably wouldn't have had to play Porno Studio Tycoon. But there's a catch too, and I don't mean just playing crappy indie games. As much as we've sort of entered into a golden age of gaming when it comes to ease of use, distribution, and accessibility, there are trade-offs for all of these conveniences. Like the fact that all this ease of distribution is a two-way street, and it's just as easy for a content developer to take stuff away from you as it is to give it. Like it or not, there are downsides to this whole development. The massive benefits that we get from content being so readily and easily available also means that developers have a quick and effective means of patching content out of games, just as they can patch it in. They have a direct pipeline to your hard drive, especially if you have automatic game updates enabled, which, let's face it, that's the default setting for pretty much everyone. And if you don't, there are ways to force your hand, such as locking players out who don't subscribe to updates that developers deem mandatory. While a no-brainer for MMOs and the like, it's not something that's exclusive to them, as many single-player games now adopt an always-online model that forces content parity to the point where it's basically its own form of digital rights management. Sometimes this is a move that makes sense. A multiplayer-focused game such as Overwatch or Dota 2, or as previously mentioned, any MMO, requires a specific set of balanced parameters in order to ensure a fair playing field. Not only that, but it also keeps the game fresh with continual evolutions of the game's mechanics, often tossing out old metagame strategies in favor of new ones enabled by tweaking the game's nuances. In many cases, reverting back to an older version is actually impossible. For instance, if I wanted to go back and play the 6.86 patch of Dota 2, but why anybody would ever want to do that, I have no idea. I've walked the paths of hell and I've come back, don't take me back, don't take me back! I simply can't do that, unless I acquired the source code for the game or reverse engineered it and hosted it onto a private server, which isn't exactly legal and definitely a violation of the end-user license agreement. One only needs to look at the fate of the World of Warcraft server in Australis to see what I mean. It promised players a vanilla experience, and was promptly shut down by the powers at Activision Blizzard. It goes to show that despite a clear and apparent public demand for forays into the nostalgic days of older games, in this case World of Warcraft up until the Wrath of the Lich King, considered by many to be the best ever expansion pack for the game, many companies are still not willing to allow them access to these older versions. Now, I'm not saying that it's the wrong decision. It is, after all, not only the developer's prerogative to enforce the vision of the game that they want to make, but also their legal right to make sure that no one else can tamper with that vision. But it's still a shame that part of the past is rendered inaccessible in a medium of entertainment that really doesn't, or at least shouldn't, have an expiration date. For all intents and purposes, the ability to play that game is lost. It's been replaced with a fixed version that, while it removed many of the game's issues, it also took away a part of the game that can't be brought back, for better or for worse. While it's an understandable concession to make for multiplayer games, it's a much harder one to make for single-player ones, but they too run the risk of just as easily being modified and changed with a click of a button. The worst offenders, however, are the games where business practices and artistic vision collide, and the game itself becomes a casualty of the battle between money and art. And it's there that we begin to see games that don't resemble themselves as they once did, or aren't as readily available to the public as perhaps they ought to be. So, remember back in 2014 when Grand Theft Auto San Andreas received a massive patch on Steam that not only broke old save games but removed resolution options as well as a sizable chunk of the game's soundtrack? This was around the same time that the game was pulled from Xbox Live to make room for the new HD version that turned out to be merely a port of the mobile version. The same thing occurred 2 years earlier to Vice City, having much of its own soundtrack removed before reappearing on digital retailers. Alan Wake suffered a similar fate, wherein that game was also removed from digital stores due to the nature of the licensing agreement over its soundtrack. However, at least in that case, people were given an opportunity to pick it up very heavily discounted during the Alan Wake Sunset sale, prior to its removal from Steam and GOG. It's small consolation, but at the same time it's also probably the best outcome that we could have gotten considering the circumstances. For me, this was a wake-up call. It was a demonstration that no game, no matter how, can and probably will be altered at some point in time. Perhaps not to that level, but the possibility is there all the same, and that sort of makes me worry. And by no means am I trying to throw shade onto Rockstar here. It's a perfectly understandable situation as to why it happened. Well, removing the music from the game, not the breaking of it and putting up an inferior version. In this case, it was due to the business agreement that saw the music licenses expire, which meant that Rockstar was no longer legally allowed to publish those versions of those games with that content. But that also doesn't take away from the fact that it also means that if you're hoping to play Vice City or San Andreas right now for the very first time, you're getting an inferior version of the game. There are more extreme examples too. If you're one of the lucky ones who downloaded and played PT and never got around to deleting it off your PlayStation's hard drive when you were done with it, congratulations! You now own a piece of hardware that can fetch you nearly $1,000 on eBay. For the rest of us, all we have left are YouTube videos to preserve it. And as far as Konami is concerned, PT is a non-game, and there isn't really anything anyone can do about it, except lament this fact, which is exactly what I'm doing now. It's crazy to think about it, but it's come to the point where old console releases for these games that came on physical media that is more or less obsolete, is now actually the superior version in some instances. Well, for one thing, it's got all its content right there on the disc. And it can't really be tampered with, as they came out during a time when online updates weren't nearly as prevalent as they are now. What you have at hand is what you get, free from tampering, free from changes. The only real downside is that it has a shelf life. It's only so good so long as it, or the hardware used to play it, continues to work. I mean, how long do you have until the hardware stops working, or it becomes too costly to purchase, or it becomes too costly to maintain before the disc you have in your hand is useless? Of course, this notion discounts emulation, which may be a saving grace in this regard, but considering the legal gray area that emulation falls under, it's hardly a safe bet. Nothing that is acquired digitally is ever exempt from any of this. That means that no video game is ever truly going to be archivable and set in a totally preserved state. And as more and more games forgo distribution via traditional means and instead move towards the digital model, and rightfully so because it is the better one, losing content may just very well be something that will become standard practice, since archival is usually an afterthought. Now, in my mind, I think that the worst culprit of this practice is 2016's Hitman. At least in the case of World of Warcraft, there still exist private servers that, while they'll never be as populous as the main game, they still offer some private sanctuary for players who want to return to the game's roots if they so wish. Hitman, on the other hand, goes so far as to offer exclusive content that actually has an expiration date. Right, so remember when I said in part 2 of this video that video games don't have an expiration date? I think Hitman 2016 is a game that actually proves this premise wrong, and I absolutely loathe it for it. Like, okay, I don't hate Hitman 2016, I think it's actually incredible, and it's probably my favorite Hitman game to date. But I hate the fact that it actually has an expiration date on content. That part just drives me crazy. So part of what makes the new Hitman game so great is the way that the levels are designed to be these wide open engines of interactivity that are meant to be consumed over and over again. By forcing the player to engage with the level repeatedly, they learn of different modes and methods to carry out their assassinations and peel back the layers that make up each level. Items are scattered throughout the world, and timed events that cause expired opportunities if you're not quick enough to react all lend a hand in teaching the player how to adapt to the game and overcome the challenges that each mission on each level presents. It's basically the same formula that every other Hitman game thus far has presented, except for Absolution, though not nearly to the degree of polish and depth that this one has. Unfortunately, the inclusion of the elusive targets throws everything I just said out the window. See, elusive targets are unique one-shot missions that put all of their emphasis on one shot. You have one chance to succeed. If the mission ends by anything else other than a restart, you can't try again. They appear in the game for a limited amount of time and are continuously cycled out to make room for new ones in a never-ending cycle of patching and updating the game. But they're all unique in that once they're pulled from the game's servers, they're gone. A part of me wonders if this was intentionally designed as a way to placate customers who bought the game early and to give them something to do while the content was being released episodically. But in the long run, all it does is harm those players who were patient and were hoping for a compilation of the game's content at a reduced price. Hitman, the complete first season, and oh god, why does it sound like I'm talking about a TV show and not a video game right now, is finally out. And while the physical disc version of the game contains all of the game's content, including the 3 bonus mission packs and 6 additional bonus missions exclusive to the PlayStation 4, a making of documentary, and even the pre-order bonus incentive, it still doesn't allow anyone who buys it access to any of the previously released elusive target events. They're gone. They're lost bits of data that are not accessible, not playable, and not retrievable. And the other thing that kind of annoys me is that you have to complete a certain number of elusive targets in order to unlock some extra costumes for Agent 47 to wear. I know, it's a very, very small thing, and it's not too difficult to manage to complete a bunch of them to get these extra costumes that have no mechanical benefit on the game. But it just rubs me the wrong way that there's some content that's specifically held behind this game mode that puts a limit on the amount of times you can play it in the first place. And it's especially bothersome because IO has already stated that it has no plans of bringing back old elusive targets because it would make the experiences less special. I think that future video game archivists will have an uphill battle ahead of them. There are already projects to document and preserve entire catalogs of what we now refer to as retro consoles as a means of backing up their data and making it available for future generations, but I'm concerned to see how these efforts will be affected by modern technological applications to games. And furthermore, which versions of these games are going to be preserved? In a case where games are becoming more fluid in their content, purists, and I use that term very, very loosely, might demand a version of the game that is unavailable. And considering that archiving is already an afterthought, the fact that we may very well already have game content out there that it's entirely lost is a thought worthy of grief all by itself. Alright, so here's the thing. I'm not advocating that we need to relive the past in order to maintain a hold on the historical building blocks that make up our cultural awareness. Events are transient, they come and go, and living the experience in the moment is what makes them so important. But media is something that exists tangibly. It's something that we can go back to and interact with, whether it's reading a book, watching a movie, or playing a video game. There's something that should be accessible regardless of when it was made or who it was necessarily made for. So with that in mind, what's the difference between Hitman's elusive targets and any other patch for a video game? The answer is, well, fundamentally, not much. It's all data being changed in the same way that it always has been. But what makes each case stand out is the meaning and the intent behind it. One carries more weight because of what that change represents, and in turn, that affects how we react to it. I can try and justify the elusive targets on the same grounds as I do a Dota 2 patch all that I want. But it's the context within that lost content that makes the former leave such a bitter taste in my mouth. And that's mostly because it represents something that's being taken away for no other reason but to trigger a reaction from the consumer to act impulsively. Act now or it's gone forever. It's really anti-consumer in a certain point of view, and definitely unfriendly to latecomers, and because of that, it's just a practice that doesn't really settle easily in my mind at all. With the amount of digital power at our fingertips, there really isn't any reason information, even as something as completely banal as the code for a video game, should ever be lost in the aether. But that's what many cultural artifacts of our time actually run the risk of doing. Each one is a small piece of the mosaic that makes up our own zeitgeist, and removing even a single piece of the glass from that makeup can alter the makeup of the entire image. On the other hand, maybe removing that piece of glass is exactly what's needed for people to take a look at it and decide that they don't really like what they're seeing. Hey, thank you very, very much for watching my video. Give it a thumbs up if you like it, a thumbs down if you didn't, and let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. If you're interested in seeing some of my other stuff, click on one of the links I've put right here, and once again, thank you so much for watching.